are more to me and more in my meditations than you might suppose. Just as you feel when you look on the river and sky, so I felt. Just as you are refreshed by the gladness of the river and the bright flow, I was refreshed. Just as you stand and lean on the rail, yet hurry with the swift current, I stood, yet was hurried. It avails not, Whitman wrote, time nor place, distance avails not. Cost, however, avails. While Walt Whitman's job was to wax poetic, the New York City Economic Development Corporation's responsibility is to provide adequate oversight and report financial information transparently on the New York City ferry system. And the audit that we are releasing today shows that during the de Blasio administration, EDC failed to provide the transparent, accurate oversight and financial management that is required of them. I am going to go through some of the findings and recommendations, but first I want to appreciate that did the hard work of this audit. So the audit manager, Gabriella Benedek, is here, our deputy controller for audits, Maura Hayes-Chaff, and our executive deputy controller for management and operations, Sandra Abellis, are all here. And obviously we have full copies of the audit, of EDC's response, of our response to their response, for all of you. So the key findings are as follows. First, during the de Blasio administration, from 2015 to 2021, EDC underreported almost $250 million in ferry expenditures. During that time, EDC incurred a total of $758 million, but they only reported $534 million as ferry-related expenses in their financial statements and other records. All those other expenses, nearly $250 million, they listed on the Department of Transportation's books as pass-throughs and in other ways that did not make clear that those are expenses of the ferry system. The largest single element of this understatement is EDC's decision in 2018 to stop including depreciation in calculating the total cost. That's a practice the city had used from 2002 until 2017, but the city removed capital expenses from its calculation in 2018. Not so coincidentally, shortly after then Mayor Bill de Blasio announced a $300 million capital investment in the system. The auditors identified $180,960,344 in capital expenses and $43,470,732 in operating expenses that were ferry-related but were not identified as such in EDC's financial reports. As a result of this $250 million understatement over those years, the city's actual subsidy per ride on the ferry system was much higher than reported. So prior to the system beginning, Mayor de Blasio initially projected that the subsidy per ride would be $6.60, but the actual subsidy per ride was nearly double that, and consistently higher than what EDC reported it was. Because they were underreporting, not including all those expenses, they also underreported quite significantly the actual per ride subsidy. So for example, in fiscal year 2021, the final one that we look at in the audit, the actual subsidy was $12.88 per ride, which was, nearly double the $6.60 that the city had originally projected, and 50% higher than the $8.59 per ride that EDC reported. Now, look, there is an important and appropriate policy debate, and I'll come back to this in a minute, to be had on whether and how much subsidy should be spent on various forms of public transit. The level of subsidy in the ferry system is higher than other forms of public transit, as the Citizens Budget Commission and others have shown, as many of you have reported. But all public transit involves subsidy. Still, it's essential that the policy conversation be based on accurate reporting, and EDC's $250 million underreporting rendered that impossible. What's more, because of poor oversight and poor financial management. Oh, yeah, so all right, so we got these great pictures that I'm gonna point to. So my point so far is about undisclosed expenditures. So you can see above the water, 534 million is what they reported, but underwater there's that 181 million in capital expenditures and $43 million in operating expenditures. That in total is what was actually spent on the system over those 5 years. And then what's more, because of poor oversight and poor financial management of the contract, our audit found that the ferry has incurred $66 million in unnecessary expenses. And we'll break that. That's all broken down both in the press release and in the audit, but I'll give you a few examples. About half of that, $34 million, is in questionable vessel expenses to Hornblower for the acquisition and construction of the vessels. So one example is that in 2016, EDC ordered an average of $4 million for the 150 river-class vessels and $7.1 million for the 350 vessels. But just 3 years later, they then paid $5.8 million instead of $4 million. And $9.1 million instead of $7.1 million, which was far above the rate of inflation from 2016 to 2019. And here's my favorite example of irresponsible expenditures. In this case here, EDC ordered and paid Hornblower $8.4 million to buy a Rockaway-class vessel, which would have cost $8.4 million. What Hornblower delivered to New York City, however, was a river-class vessel, which EDC subsequently valued on its books at $5.6 million. EDC accepted delivery of the $5.6 million river-class vessel. I should know whether that's a river-class or a Rockaway-class vessel, but they did not insist that Hornblower refund the $2.8 million difference between the $8.4 million vessel they paid for and the $5.6 million vessel that they received. Let's see, another example is that at the beginning, before Hornblower operated the system, another company, Billy Bay, operated the East River route. But in order to consolidate the lines in the manner that the mayor wanted to announce, EDC terminated Billy Bay's contract early. Billy Bay charged $21 million in early termination fees, for which the city got nothing, and then $3 million to Hornblower in a transition fee, so $24 million for that transition. And through a series of weak enforcement and contract provisions, our audits found another $3 million in unsubstantiated payments to Hornblower, again totaling $66 million in unnecessary expenses. Now look, this is a good example. The ferry system has provided meaningful new commuting options for residents from the Rockaways to St. George to Soundview. You can see from the long line, it provides a great way for folks to get from Manhattan out to the Rockaways when they're heading to the beach. We should utilize New York's harbor, New York's waterways, to expand our transportation options, not just because we love Walt Whitman, but because we need all the public transit options that we can possibly provide. However, for a successful 21st century ferry system, EDC needs to provide more transparent reporting, better cost controls, and I'll get to this in more detail, a new RFP to operate the system. So toward the end of 21st century ferry system with adequate financial management and cost controls and more efficient operations, our audit makes 11 recommendations. EDC agreed with 2, partially agreed with 3, stated that it's already in compliance with 2, and disagreed with 4. They're all in the audit, but I'll drill down on just a couple of them. So first, EDC did agree to provide enhanced financial reporting on its website of the broader set of costs involved in the ferry system. However, this was one of the partials because they did not commit to disclose all ferry-related expenditures in their audited financial statements, as we recommend and as we firmly believe they should do. Second, EDC agreed to include some additional quote-unquote non-operator costs in that subsidy per ride calculation, for example, the city's own costs in Pier 11 or in the other stations throughout the system. They have agreed to include. However, they have refused to include capital asset depreciation, the biggest single underreporting. And again, it was the city's practice to do that from 2002 to 2017, but they have still refused to accept that recommendation. Third, EDC refused to seek recoupment of overpayments to Hornblower, totaling approximately $12 million. So we outline in the audit $12 million that we believe they should recoup from Hornblower, including, for example, the $2.8 million that Hornblower owes us, the $6 million ferry that we paid $8.4 million for. Now, finally, EDC did agree, and this is important, to issue a new RFP to operate the system. And that is really a critical opportunity to move forward from the days of financial mismanagement and underreporting to a new, appropriately reported, better priced, better operated, and better managed 21st century ferry system. That new RFP can be an opportunity to address many of the issues that we raise. And I'll just give you one example here. A lot of people, including the prior controller, have been advocates of what's called dynamic pricing. We believe that much of the pressure from City Hall on EDC regarding the system was because Mayor de Blasio made clear he wanted a $275 cost across the ferry system, regardless of whether you're a day-to-day commuter coming from the Rockaways or the Bronx, and or whether you're a one-day tourist or weekender heading out to the Rockaways on that system. Many people favor instead a dynamic pricing model, which looks at the possibility that for highly sought-after rides and infrequent ones, people would pay more, just as you do on a commuter rail or an express bus, that you'd pay more if you're a tourist or a one-timer heading out from Manhattan to the Rockaways. You could apply fair fares so that if you're actually a low-income or working-class person in the Rockaways who's relying on that for your daily commuting, you might pay less than $275 as you do in the fair fares system. But a dynamic pricing model probably makes sense to look at. The RFP could be one opportunity to explore things like dynamic pricing, which would both help operate the system more effectively and then reduce the pressure to understate the expenses and falsely report on what the system actually costs to operate. So we are glad that EDC accepted that recommendation, and we look forward in the coming days to reviewing the RFP. And we'll be glad to look at it when they release it and share it, to talk about the ways in which it does or doesn't address the issues that are reflected in this audit, and give us all an opportunity to move forward together. I'll take questions, but I'm going to conclude with a little more Walt Whitman, just because they gave me a podium right in front of the ferry system, and my staff couldn't stop me, though they tried. Flow on, river, flow with the flood tide, and ebb with the ebb tide. Cross from shore to shore, countless crowds of passengers. Stand up, tall masts of Manhattan. Stand up, beautiful hills of Brooklyn. Thrive, cities. Bring your freight, bring your shows. Ample and sufficient rivers. Keep your places. Objects than which none else is more lasting. Thank you guys for attending, and we will be glad to take some questions.
Yeah, so I'm going to do on topic first. Yeah, Kevin.
So let me just first distinguish between the audit and sort of broader policy views, which I actually should have done when I switched to the conversation about dynamic pricing, because I just want to be really clear that on the audit findings and recommendations, we're relying on the great team of auditors who dug in, expense by expense. You can see it in excruciating detail. I just want to give them credit for that. And this audit looks at these questions of, were expenses properly reported? What were the financial mismanagement? And also it's some issues of inaccuracies in counts of ridership on and off the ferries. Then there's obviously a broader set of policy questions. on which I certainly support a model of dynamic. And the audit calls for a new RFP for a whole set of reasons, not only because dynamic pricing is a good opportunity, but because the current contract embeds a lot of problems. So, totally support having a new RFP. I support looking at a model of dynamic pricing. I don't have a strong opinion on whether it should stay at EDC or DOT. DOT is our transportation system, but so long as costs are honestly and fully and clearly disclosed, I don't have a strong opinion on which agency it should be at. I will say, though, that we continue to believe strongly that these costs need to be disclosed in the ferry audit. And if DOT would do that, but EDC won't do it, then that might be a reason to consider switching.
Next question, Dave.
So one thing that's worth noting about the audit, and lost my notes on this, is one finding that we have is that EDC prematurely extended the existing contract, which was supposed to run, I think, through June 30th of next year. Was originally scheduled to run through April 30th, 23, and they extended through September 2023. And we actually think that was a mistake, that it would have been better to leave it at its original expiration date in April and move quickly on with the new RFP. That's already done, so Hornblower's got their contract through September 2023. So yes, any new RFP would pick up in October 2023, so a year and a couple of months from now. You'll have to ask EDC or City Hall when they're going to put that RFP out, and will it be issued and with responses in a way that's timely to get it done by October 2023. But I take them at their word, and since they were clear the places they didn't agree on the one that they did, I'll take them at their word that it's their intention to get the RFP out in time for an October 2023 start.
More on-topic questions. Anna?
Yeah. So what I believe, the audit looks at what happened and not at why it happened. We did not get correspondence between City Hall and EDC. But I do think common sense, tells you a lot here. When he announced the system, then Mayor de Blasio made clear that he wanted a $275 price across the board. A lot of people, even at the time, pushed for a dynamic pricing model, and throughout, and you can ask him about this today. Obviously, he's still out and available in public, but he was clearly invested in the system that he proposed. So it's reasonable to guess that there was essentially pressure on EDC to put forward information that showed a lower subsidy per ride in a way that would be more consistent with the goals that the mayor had laid out for the system. That's not that's a guess. That's not proven in the audit, but I think it's a pretty reasonable assumption. It is my assumption of about what happened here. Gabrielle or Maura, the ferry shuttle bus operation, is there in the audit anything about you guys can come up and answer these questions. The question is, did we find underreporting or financial mismanagement around the Rockaway shuttle bus operation?
No, what we found about the...
Good.
So what we mentioned in the report was that they paid actually less than what the component fee was, about $400K. The operation costed about 300 something K, so there was a surplus of 87 up to the 400, and we just questioned why that was not recouped or better used to expand the service. That's what our audit found.
I mean, first I would invite you guys to ask him about this audit. This is a very substantial financial underreporting and mismanagement. $250 million of underreporting raises a lot of questions, and those questions should be asked.
A lot of this has been out there and reported, as you noted, by several of our publications, news outlets, and also the Citizens Budget Commission. So why do the report now? And second, did the system overexpand? Was it too ambitious?
So first I will say what has been out there is mostly how much, was still based on the data that EDC was reporting. So a lot of what was out there was that the ferry is a relatively expensive form of public transportation, even if you accepted the numbers that EDC was providing. Giving an actual accounting of the full cost of the system, we felt was really important. So I will say this audit obviously started in the prior administration. It was, it began, I don't know if it began last year or the year before, but there was a feeling amongst the audit team that it was important to really look at the full cost of the system. There's just a difference between a report that says this is an expensive form of public transportation and one that digs in and says, how are we managing it? And I think there's a lot in here that has not been previously reported or identified. And especially as, I think it's great that there will be a new RFP that can look at a set of these questions and that can be informed by this audit and give us a much stronger chance to move forward productively.
Did it overexpand the system, and should the price of the fare structure?
Look, I think if you don't have a dynamic pricing model, it is very hard to figure out good expansion. If you have a dynamic pricing model, you have a lot better chance of figuring out, is this a route, I'll just give the Rockaway example here, right? That's a fairly unique route, the one that goes from here to the Rockaways. But you could price that one. I don't have any doubt that you can price the Rockaway line at a way that is more than $275 a person, that a lot of people will still take, and that you can, based on the data of ridership, operate effectively. And I think providing service to residents in Soundview in the Bronx, like if you're going to operate a system, then looking at who really needs public transit and who's in a transit desert, and providing some service to Bronx residents who lack public transit is great. But figuring out a way to provide that expansion, first in a way that's just honest and clear how much it costs, and then second, that can really dig in on, okay, what is ridership? How often are we going to run it? What do we got to charge for that? Expansion without a dynamic pricing model was probably irresponsible. Moving to a dynamic pricing model could make it much more effective, and then you can serve a wide range of different kinds of locations appropriately.
Yeah, Anna? Can you describe the pushback from the EDC to recoup
We had good back and forth with EDC. I will say, EDC President Andrew Kimball is somebody that I've known a long time. I did certainly talk to him about this audit. You can see their very long and lengthy response, and you can see our auditor's response to each one of their findings. I'm learning here too. This was like, in some ways, we've released a series of audits, but this is the hardest hitting one that we've released so far. So for me, it was useful to see how much back and forth and engagement there is. So our auditors produce all their findings, they do an exit conference, they have some conversations and dialogue, then they issue the written findings and recommendations, then we get the response, then we issue the final. So they did evolve for sure. Like, I think the commitment at least to disclose all the expenditures is meaningful, and their commitment to issue a new RFP is meaningful. I did push specifically on this recoupment issue. Like, I want to know where that $2.8 million is, and the taxpayers of New York should either get the $8.4 million ferry that they paid for, or we should get the $2.8 million back. And that is part of the, that's one of the elements of the $12 million. EDC on that one did not at any point indicate openness to seeking recoupment from Hornblower, and we believe they should. I don't. You'll have to ask them why. You'll have to ask them why.
1 second. Let's go with Bobby.
The report does not find wrongdoing at a level that either would, involve any allegations or referral, and we do not recommend that they be excluded from bidding on the subsequent RFP. That said, there's a lot to answer for in here. Yes, I mean, it's on EDC to demand either our $8.4 million ferry or our $2.8 million refund. But it is incumbent on Hornblower to be more forthcoming about why a number of the issues that are identified are places where they did not fully document what a cost was. And again, it's on EDC not to pay it if there's not documentation or to insist on that documentation. But yes, there's quite a few findings in here that speak to places where Hornblower failed to document or failed to provide what was contracted for. Again, this was an audit of EDC and their financial oversight, but it certainly raises a series of questions about Hornblower.
Why does it even matter? And what do you think the provider subsidy, is appropriate to be?
So it does matter, and knowing what we're actually spending is essential for making good and appropriate decisions about, where we want to put city resources and subsidies. I've said this a few times, but I'll say it again in this way. Personally, I feel more comfortable, subsidizing the transit of a daily commuter from the Rockaways who works in Manhattan, who, this would be, than I do subsidizing to the same level a tourist or somebody who's going out to the beach on a weekend. Like, that's a policy choice we have to make. It's the same ferry trip. But there's a good reason for thinking differently about which one we'd want to subsidize and which one we wouldn't want to subsidize. And if you don't know the full cost, you don't know how much you're subsidizing, you can't make that policy decision reasonably. The core disagreement, they more or less acknowledge the operating expenditure under reporting and commit to report it and commit to include it in the cost per ride and therefore the subsidy per ride. They do not agree to include the capital expenditures in the audit or in the subsidy per ride or the cost per ride. They did from 2002 to 2017, and they stopped at the moment when the mayor announced a big capital expenditure in the system. So again, this kind of goes back to the question of what do I think happened there. We didn't, I don't have a smoking gun email, but it seems pretty likely that because they decided to make a big capital expenditure in the system, essentially they purchased a lot more of the ferries. They had previously been, the ferries had been owned by Hornblower, and the city was paying to rent. This is a good example of why they're basically the same thing. Before the city made a big additional capital expenditure, Hornblower owned more of the ferries, and so of course we paid them, and that was considered an operating expense. Like if you're renting the ferries, if you're paying on the operating side, you're paying and you're operating. Now all of a sudden you buy the ferries so that now you own them, you've made a capital expenditure. Hornblower is still operating them, you're still paying, but now if you just magically put your capital expenses below the line, you don't have to show them, even though effectively, it's the same total set of costs in the system. So we do believe that the capital expenditures are important to report. If they want to show it both ways, show it both ways. Like a simple answer here would be to give it as total operating expenses, operating subsidy per ride. Total capital expenses, capital subsidy per ride, total ferry-related expenses, total ferry subsidy per ride. If they like to do it that way in their audit, we'd be delighted to say that they accepted our recommendation. I do think it matters. And I then, to your final question, what should it be? That is an appropriate policy conversation. The audit says disclose, be clear, be thoughtful in how you do it, what the right level of, subsidy relative to other forms of transit, which have different costs but are priced differently, a really good policy conversation to have. I hope the new RFP will invite it in a productive way.
Steve?
Yeah. These are great questions. I want to see the RFP, as a first. I mean, look, we are disappointed in the recommendations that they did not accept. Let me be clear. I mean, the mismanagement and underreporting that we're talking about happened under the de Blasio administration. But the response to the audit and which recommendations to accept and not accept are happening now. And as I've made clear a few times, they should agree to fully report the cost in the audited financial statements. If they want to distinguish between operating and capital, fine, but disclose them all. They should agree to seek recoupment from Hornblower for the $12 million that we identify. And we've created a new website, a new thing on our website, which you can go to that didn't exist before, where we track follow-up on recommendations, and we will continue to push and follow up on these recommendations. At the same time, I am eager to see the new RFP. Like I say, EDC did engage constructively with us, and there was a meaningful back and forth. And because they've agreed, in some ways, I do think the most important recommendation here is to issue an RFP for a new operator. A lot will be in that RFP, what the city expects from its operator, what kinds of disclosures, how that contract will operate. A lot will be determined by that RFP. So we'll be reading that RFP very closely, and I'll be glad to answer this question again after we can take a look at it.
Last question.
Sure. Well, first, obviously, underreporting by $250 million the cost of a program in the city, that's a kind of hide the ball that is bad for government. So, if you care about the ferries and you want a good ferry operated, it's in your interest to have honest, clear, truthful information that helps us move forward. If you care about good government and about your city being honest and telling the truth at this time of very low trust in government, whether you like a program or dislike a program, whether it's your favorite or your least favorite, you rely on the city to be honest in how much things cost so that we could make real, clear shared decisions about where the money's going. And when hide the ball is played with any amount, but certainly with nearly $250 million, you can't have confidence that your city is just telling the truth and providing the information that you need. So there's a core good government interest here that is really critical across programs, as well as a core set of transit questions for those who care about the ferries.
Okay. Everyone good on topic? Anyone have off?
Those were good. You guys asked a lot of ferry questions, and this is good.
I want to ask about my garbage trucker. Talk about undisclosed costs today. Are you seeking FOIA guidance for what you do? Are you disclosures or recusals when it comes to contracts you approve affiliated with the Rice nonprofit?
So, Clayton, I appreciate the question. I'm glad for the opportunity to clarify, and I guess I'll clarify a few things. First of all, Nonprofit New York, which you might not have been able to tell from the article yesterday, but I'll clarify. Nonprofit New York is an advocacy and trade association. They are not a lobbying firm. They do not lobby on behalf of their members individually, not with the Comptroller's office, not with anyone in the city. They advocate for citywide issues related to nonprofits. Second, the Comptroller's office doesn't determine which contracts get funded, who gets funded, how much they get funded, or where that goes. Those are decisions made by city agencies, by City Hall, by the council, and those contracts come to the Comptroller's office for registration. We have a staff under the Deputy Comptroller for contracting and procurement who reviews, was all the paperwork in order? Is the money in the bank to pay them? Were proper procedures followed? It's a great staff. they have registered just since January 1st 10,000 contracts worth $30 billion. I don't have an account in that system. I don't review the contracts. I can't push the button to register them. That is done 100% by the staff under our deputy controller and is essentially a ministerial function handled by staff. It is not a discretionary function in which the controller has some role. We don't steer, we don't decide who gets funding, we register all the city contracts. So yes, before I came into office in November, I reached out to the Conflicts of Interest Board and said, my wife is the CEO of Nonprofit New York. So they knew, they gave some guidance on a task force that we had. And then, yes, yesterday after the article ran, we flipped the article to the Conflicts of Interest Board, and they affirmed that because we play a ministerial and not discretionary function in contracts, and because Nonprofit New York is not a lobbying firm and does not lobby on behalf of individual clients, that there is no conflict with the city's Conflict of Interest law or Article 68.
Any other questions?
That'll be at a later date.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you all for coming. Happy ferries. This was nice job, staff who organized this location.